For 30 years, Graham Norton built his career on a single, deceptively simple skill: making people feel at ease long enough to forget the cameras were rolling. Not comfortable in a bland, corporate green room way, but genuinely, disarmingly at ease. The kind of ease that makes a guarded Hollywood legend lean forward in their chair and say something they hadn't planned to say. The kind that turns a nervous first-time guest into a clip that lives on the internet for a decade. Night after night, series after series, Norton walked out onto that stage and performed what looked from the outside like effortless conversation. The way a concert pianist makes an impossibly complex piece look like something anyone could sit down and play. The audience always laughed. The guests always seemed to enjoy themselves. And the illusion held season after season until it didn't. Because behind every flawless broadcast, there were nights that nearly broke him. Nights when the machinery of charm ground to a halt and no amount of wit or patience or professional grace could restart it. Nights that Norton filed away quietly, the way experienced performers file away their worst moments. Not to forget them, but because some stories take years to fully understand. He spent decades deflecting the question with a smile, redirecting it with a joke, giving safe, crowd-pleasing non-answers that satisfy the interviewer without revealing anything real. But now, at 62, something has shifted. The careful diplomacy is loosening. And in a series of rare, unguarded moments at literary festivals and long-form interviews, the most charming man on British television has finally started telling the truth about the nights that tested everything he knew about his craft. 6 guests, 6 very different kinds of failure. And one of them, the last one, the one he saved for years before he could bring himself to name it plainly, wasn't really a failure of television at all. It was something far heavier, something that only revealed its true shape years later when the world finally caught up with the man sitting across from him on that sofa. But we'll get there. First, you need to understand what made these nights so damaging and why they stayed with a man who, by any reasonable measure, had seen absolutely everything. To understand why these 6 nights haunted Norton the way they did, you first have to understand what makes him exceptional in the first place. He isn't a comedian firing jokes at passive targets. He isn't a journalist laying traps or a broadcaster filling time. He is, at his core, a conductor, a man who reads the room the way a musician reads a score, adjusting tempo in real time, pulling out the quiet notes when a guest is overwhelmed and building toward crescendo when the energy demands it. His entire show operates on a principle of reciprocity. A guest offers something, an anecdote, a moment of vulnerability, a self-deprecating laugh, and Norton catches it midair and gives it back twice as alive. The audience feels the exchange happening and rides the current between them. It's intimate in a way that most television never manages to be, and it requires, above everything else, a willing partner on the other side of the conversation. Which means Norton's show has exactly one structural weakness: a guest who won't play. Not a guest who's demanding or temperamental or occasionally rude. Those he handles without breaking a sweat. What actually breaks his rhythm, what genuinely threatens the architecture of everything he's built, is a guest who simply isn't there, who sits on that red sofa and refuses, for whatever reason, to meet him even halfway. Over 30 years of broadcasting, Norton has encountered that failure in every possible form. And the 6 names he's finally willing to say out loud are the 6 nights when even his extraordinary gifts weren't enough to bridge the gap. The first time the show truly slipped from his hands, it wasn't through silence. It was through chaos, the kind that arrives smiling and then detonates from the inside. In 2013, with a full sofa and a live audience buzzing with anticipation, Mark Wahlberg walked in and immediately set the room at ease. He was charming, quick, the version of himself audiences expected, the wisecracking Hollywood tough guy who knew how to work a crowd. For the first 20 minutes, everything held. Norton relaxed into the rhythm. The other guests, Michael Fassbender, Sarah Silverman, found their footing. The show breathed, and something shifted, slowly at first, then all at once. Whatever Wahlberg had consumed before arriving finally saturated his system, and the man who had walked in sharp and in control became someone else entirely. Unpredictable, untethered, impossible to redirect. He talked over Sarah Silverman mid-sentence, barreling through her stories with slurred energy that made the audience laugh nervously, unsure whether the spectacle was intentional. He climbed onto Norton's lap at one point, arm draped around the host's shoulder, grinning at the camera with the full confidence of a man who had lost track of exactly how far over the line he'd gone. Norton kept smiling, that practiced, camera-ready smile that hides everything. But his eyes told a different story entirely. Fassbender, profoundly patient, tried to rescue a particular anecdote, pulling the room back towards some semblance of coherence. Norton, sitting across from him, felt the relief of narrative beginning to reassemble itself, a lifeline thrown at exactly the right moment. And then he glanced over at Wahlberg. The actor was asleep. Not nodding, asleep. On live television. The audience laughed the way people laugh when they genuinely don't know what else to do. Norton finished the show through pure muscle memory, the way a pilot lands a damaged plane, technically, professionally, without letting anyone see how bad the instruments looked. Years later, at the Henley Literary Festival, he finally let the memory surface without the protective layer of humor around it. He'd arrived fine, Norton said. 20 minutes later, hell had arrived with him. He still names it, without a moment's hesitation, as the worst night of his professional life. If Wahlberg was too much, too loud, too present, too combustibly unpredictable, Mickey Rourke was his precise opposite, and in some ways even more difficult to manage. Because with chaos, at least there is energy in the room to redirect. With Rourke, there was simply nothing. He arrived already somewhere else, sunglasses on indoors, a drink nearby, lighting cigarette after cigarette in defiance of studio rules with the quiet, almost serene confidence of a man who had stopped caring about consequences long before walking through the door. Production staff recalled him arriving late, visibly irritated, speaking barely a word before filming began. No nerves, no preparation, no apparent interest in the evening ahead. When the cameras rolled, he answered Norton's questions in clipped fragments, single-clause responses that went nowhere, mumbled through with the energy of someone being interviewed against their will. Norton tried every angle available to him. Humor, flattery, provocation, direct confrontation. Nothing landed. Rourke stared past him, fiddled with his lighter, stared past him again. At one point, the silence stretched long enough that Norton was forced to fill it with a story about himself, just to give the audience something to follow. Later, Rourke showed no awareness that anything unusual had happened, brushing off his UK talk show appearances as nonsense for the tabloids and drawing a clear, unapologetic line. He wasn't there to perform. He didn't do the clown stuff. Norton, ever diplomatic in public, said simply that Rourke had been exhausting, the weariness in the word unmistakable even through the interview smile. He felt, he said, less like a chat show host and more like a teacher losing control of a school trip. He never invited him back. Then came a different category of difficulty. Guests who weren't hostile or reckless, but simply constitutionally, fundamentally wrong for the format in a way that produced its own particular kind of pain. Kevin Costner arrived on the sofa with the calm, self-contained gravity of a man who had never quite understood why anyone would want to perform personality on command. Norton, who could draw conversation out of a stone given enough time, launched his usual battery of warmly constructed questions and watched each one meet the same quiet, composed wall. Costner wasn't rude. He wasn't disengaged. He was simply operating on a register entirely incompatible with what the show required. Measured, interior, serious in a way that made Norton's lightness feel almost reckless by contrast. At one excruciating point, another guest asked Costner something, and he came alive, animated, warm, interested, as if Norton himself had been trying the wrong frequency all along. Norton later told the Express what that felt like. He said Costner looked at him like he was asking whether he had to keep talking to this man. He gave half an answer. Then somebody else asked, and he lit up completely. He's never fully explained what that moment cost him in terms of professional pride, but the fact that he's still describing it years later says something. Robert De Niro was, if anything, more daunting, because De Niro arrived with the full weight of cinematic legend attached to every silence, which made each non-answer, somehow, both more frustrating and more understandable. Here was a man who had communicated everything that mattered about him through Travis Bickle, Jake LaMotta, Jimmy Conway, through pure physical and emotional expression channeled through character, never through small talk, never through the casual self-exposure that Norton's show demanded. Norton knew this going in and tried to work around it, approaching from angles rather than head-on, trying to locate the story beneath the reserve. Nothing opened it. De Niro gave short, cautious replies, paused at length before answering, and twice offered the faint smile of someone who recognized what was being asked of them and had decided, not unkindly, not to do it. At one point, he began what sounded genuinely like a fascinating anecdote. The whole audience leaned in, Norton included, willing it towards some kind of revelation. De Niro stopped mid-sentence. He asked the room, almost philosophically, why exactly he was telling this story. Nobody had an answer. The footage was cut. Norton said later at the Cheltenham Literature Festival that De Niro wasn't a storyteller, that he wasn't verbal in that way, that sitting across from him felt like reaching for something just beyond your fingertips for an entire half hour. The respect was real. The exhaustion was realer. Daryl Hannah sits at a different emotional register from the others, and perhaps that's what made her the most quietly distressing. She didn't fight the format the way Rourke did, or override it the way Wahlberg did, or simply misunderstand it the way Costner and De Niro did. She seemed to have simply receded from it entirely, retreating somewhere inside herself that the cameras and the audience and Norton's careful warmth couldn't reach. She arrived tense, spoke little backstage, and when the filming began, she answered in single syllables, her gaze fixed somewhere past the lights, giving nothing, not from hostility, but from some deeper, private withdrawal that felt almost involuntary.